you so much for joining FIRE on this awesome Student Press Freedom Day. We're so excited to have you here. We are just going to wait a few minutes to make sure that everyone who wants to be here can join. But we're excited to talk about the student press and the First Amendment today. So just give us a few minutes. Just to let you know, in the YouTube description, you'll find a link to a survey that you can take to give us feedback on this event. Let us know what you like about it, what you don't like about it. And if you provide your name and mailing address, we'll send you some really cool socks and a notebook for your participation, because we're just really excited to have all of you here. So I'm just going to wait, like I said, till about maybe 1:31, 1:32, and then we will kick it off. Throughout the event, if you have questions that you would like to ask the panelists, then feel free to put those in the chat on YouTube, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can during the last part of the event. It's 1:30 now, so for anyone who's joined us in the last couple of minutes since I said this, we're going to wait till about like 1:31, 1:32 before we kick off, because I know some people, tend to join a minute or two late. And I know a lot of people are probably joining us straight from watching that really awesome documentary screening that the Student Press Law Center just hosted. I was also watching that, so I'm glad to have anyone who's come over from that event now be here to talk about student press with us. So we'll get started here in just a minute or two, probably about one more minute. So I'm being told we have a bunch of viewers, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. And if people roll in a little bit late, that's okay. I just want to welcome all of you to our panel discussion on student press war stories, where we're going to have some FIRE staffers who are former student journalists talk about their experiences as journalists and now their experiences as First Amendment advocates. And we're going to be shining a light today, of course, on Student Press Freedom Day on the freedom of the student press. So we are also going to be joined in a little bit by a really fantastic student journalist, Cassie Conklin. But first, we're going to have FIRE's president and CEO, Greg Lukianoff. He's going to talk about his experience as a student journalist. And so without further ado, well, I'm going to introduce Greg, who is, like I said, our president and CEO, but he's also a New York Times bestselling author and also a recipient of the Playboy Freedom of Expression Award, which I hear is something he's very proud of.
Very proud of that, yes.
But maybe even more importantly, during college, Greg served as a Metro reporter, a columnist, and was on the editorial team of the American University Eagle, which is the student publication there at American University. So without further ado, Greg, please take us off.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I came into undergrad already pretty radicalized in favor of freedom of speech, partially from my own upbringing and my family having to flee authoritarian dictatorships. But it was really working as a reporter in undergrad that got me radicalized into it. Like, it really got me excited about it. And I proceeded to go to law school, specialized in First Amendment law, even though people thought that was kind of crazy. Worked at the ACLU. You know, it really did. I take college journalism extremely seriously, and I'm honored to be talking to you. I, as per usual, am going to try to cover way too much ground over too short of a period of time. And I wanted to kind of jump right in to some of the interesting ideas that I feel like aren't very well conveyed on campuses at the moment. So this is called Journalism in the Age of Negation. I will explain what negation means at the end, but let's just jump into it. Here first is just a very simple argument that I feel like I have to make to audiences all the time. How we handled dissenters in history. Now, I think it's one of these things that just isn't appreciated what human society normally looks like. This is the way we handle dissenters. We make them drink hemlock, we burn them at the stake. That's Giordano Bruno, the first Trekkie of all time. And we crucify them. And it wasn't just Jesus. A lot of people were crucified. And generally that was for the crime of sedition, essentially. And outside of the US, you can still see all of these things in action. I'm very thankful to Sarah McLachlan at FIRE, who shines a light on how free speech is, how restrictions on free speech manifest in the rest of the world. You might know a lot of these stories, including Pussy Riot, Glenn Greenwald, one of the whistleblowers about COVID, who died of COVID shortly thereafter, two people who were accused of blasphemy. That reflects more what the world has looked like throughout all of human history. That's why I talk about the First Amendment as being the eternally radical idea, because it isn't some humble idea. It is an attempt to get rid of the things that we used to actually have violent wars about, and instead have settle these things through words.
Right.
Yes?
I hate to interrupt you, but I think we're having a technical issue with your screen sharing.
Oh,
so we're
goodness.
Not seeing your slides.
You're kidding me. Okay. Wow, that's embarrassing. Okay, let's try that again. Funny, I got on early and even practice all this stuff. Okay, let's go through. Now you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, so here we go. Journalism, age of negation, how we handle dissenters, hemlock, burning, crucifixion, international scenarios, and the eternally radical idea. Misunderstanding freedom of speech. I feel like on campus, this is the argument you essentially get, is that freedom of speech is just the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And what is missed is that the powerful are always protected in human society. The rich are always protected. They have their wealth and power to protect them. The majority is always protected by the vote. And that's why historically, free speech, when the First Amendment started to become strong after 1925, it was minority opinions that were empowered by it. The gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement. John Lewis, who recently died, was one of the biggest proponents of freedom of speech. So it's an argument about power dynamics that gets fundamentally misunderstood on campuses, partially because the power dynamics on campus are very unusual. So anyway, censorship and the destruction of the written word. This is something that really frustrated me during my time at FIRE, was watching actual student newspaper theft and destruction. Newspaper theft has actually gone up, or actually it's gone up and down throughout my time. It seemed particularly ridiculous to be destroying newspapers during the time of electronic editions, yet we've seen spikes recently. We've even seen newspapers burned, which is not a good sign for the future of small L liberal institutions. This is a little bit talking about 2019. We saw a real spike in newspaper theft and destruction. And what's interesting about it, I wrote about this in my first book, Unlearning Liberty. Those newspaper thefts are often, they're not particularly political. They're oftentimes, I don't like the coverage of my fraternity or sorority. There was one about sorority destroyed a whole run of the press because they didn't like an article saying that they had mold in their sorority house. So very interesting and of course kind of sad cases. So, oh yeah, and as far as one that I just kind of blows me away was Texas A&M coach who was proud of his players for going out and destroying a press run that was critical of the football team. So in terms of articles that we've dealt over the years, we've had lots of press cases, and this is one of the ones that really kind of blew me away. Early on at University Alaska Fairbanks, these students they would do a fun star. They do a single comedy issue of the newspaper. They included this picture from the PG-13 movie Patch Adams, and apparently that was got them investigated for something like 18 months for harassment. They also did a fairly serious piece on acquaintance rape, and that was another reason why they were accused of having committed harassment, which is kind of an amazing accusation to say that accurately covering the news or making a joke from a movie constituted something that needed to be investigated for 18 months. Under the First Amendment, it absolutely didn't. And if people are trying to tell you on your campus that you can be even just investigated for this kind of stuff, please contact us or the Student Press Law Center right away. The Observer, Central Washington University. This one's kind of fun because what you're seeing there is an actual brain trust session of people trying to figure out how to get away with punishing the student newspaper without running afoul of the First Amendment, and watching them kind of like, maybe if we do it this time, we can get it. But thankfully, since this was all on tape, we could intervene to prevent it from going further. You're going to hear from Cassie Conklin shortly about the Frostburg State University case. And this is just about as raw power playing as it comes. Cassie was covering as sort of inept handling of the COVID crisis on campus. And they tried every trick in the book to punish her. So polarization hits trust in journalism. We're living in a very interesting time. The polarization that I talk about in my book, Coddling the American Mind, has just gotten so much more intense. And as you can see, our country is splitting along lines of whether or not we trust the media. This is definitely due in parts to the creation niche media, definitely due to websites, on the right that are telling people that you can't trust the mainstream media, so you have to go increasingly fringy. But I don't want to let journalism entirely off the hook here. I think sometimes they're very quick to be like, oh, this is just these crazy phenomena, the conspiracy theories that are actually creating the situation that makes journalists look bad. But we also at the same time have to own our mistakes, our misrepresentations, and get really do something about this sort of cracking down on objectivity. So what you can see here, an article called Bagman. This was a big mistake by the New York Post, targeting people for the Boston Marathon bombing. They picked the wrong ones and really hurt these people's lives. This one is amazing. This was just from yesterday, talking about, oh my God, like a scare headline saying, oh my God, we're paying for these guys' defense. It's like, yes, they're called public defenders. they're not actually usually considered a scandal, but you're presenting them as that. And as far as people on the right, when they complain about it, one thing that is consistent is talking about, the repetition of the mostly peaceful protests. That felt very much like sort of playing down situations that in some cases were actually, lots of destruction of property over the summer, and some people badly hurt and some people even killed. Journalistic objectivity isn't realistic, young reporters say. In reality, nothing and nobody is neutral. Congratulations. Students seem to have discovered something we've known for a very long time, is that objectivity is hard to achieve, maybe impossible. But if you give up on trying to achieve it, you will end up so far from the mark. And also, frankly, nobody will trust you, and they probably shouldn't. And this brings me to what I named the whole talk about the age of negation. This is Martin Gurry's observation that the explosion of social media information technology has tremendous power to tear things down, institutions, ideas, and people, but it can't really build yet. And that's where you are. You've got millions of eyes on every single article you write in some cases, and they can tear it to pieces. And sometimes that negation is actually very important because all of these people who are policing the news might actually be right, and they could actually correct, and they hold you to a higher standard than journalists have ever been held before. At the same time, they can make ad hominem attacks, they can distract you, they can supply disinformation. So currently, we are in a particularly anarchical period for the media. We're in a particularly anarchical period, and we don't know when we're going to come out of it. But under these circumstances, we are relying on journalists more than ever to actually try to tell us what the world looks like. So that leads me just to what I really want to conclude on, which is, and I am a proud former student journalist. I take this very seriously. It's one of the things that got me into First Amendment in the first place. Remember that simply knowing the world as it is extremely hard. Jonathan Rauch is writing a book on this called The Constitution of Knowledge. It's as if we have been convinced somehow along the lines that the world is easy to know and easy to understand. One of the greatest discoveries in human history is known as the discovery of ignorance, that essentially realizing that in the grand scheme of things, reality is hard to know. Is an important discovery, and journalists' jobs are hard enough to begin with. Your job is to describe the world in its richness and complexity, and most importantly, if what you find always reflects your pre-existing beliefs or expectations, no matter what perspective you're coming from, be suspicious about it. When things work out exactly how you figured they would, maybe you're engaging in some confirmation bias, because it's powerful. And frankly, it's not necessarily that things have to work out according to someone else's narrative. In my experience, things just end up being weirder than you would expect when you really dig into some issues. Sometimes more interesting, but never, very rarely as simple as any kind of ideology would say it should be. And it's the job of a journalist to explain that richness, complexity, and strangeness about the world in which we actually live. And I call on you to I know you can't quite achieve objectivity, but don't give up on it as an idea. Knowing the world is explaining the world to people fairly and impartially is part of your job, and it's a noble calling. And I hope that people will, of good conscience and critical minds, will continue to go into this field. So, and of course, this is a quote from the FIRE co-founder, Alan Charles Kors, which I think is also true. And thank you so much for having me. And if you want to contact me directly, this is my email. This is my book website. This is where you can find me. I also write a blog called The Eternally Radical Idea on the FIRE website. There's an article about Martin Gurry's idea of negation. I hope you give it a read. And, thank you so much for your time. And if you get in trouble, contact FIRE, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We really appreciate your remarks there. And I think that the reminder to get back to objectivity, or at least strive for objectivity, is one that's always salient. As a former student journalist myself, and someone with a couple of journalism degrees, I know that's something that we're always having to remind ourselves about. So before we get into the second part of our event, we're going to have a really great panel talking about our experiences as student journalists and the experiences of student journalists today. I do want to remind everyone who's watching that in the description on YouTube, you can see our a survey. And if you take that survey and give us feedback on what you liked about this event, what you didn't like about this event, and you provide us with your name and mailing address, we will be super happy to send you a pair of socks and a notebook. So please take that survey. And also, as our panel discusses student press freedom, I know that there's always lots of questions. So please feel free to drop your questions in the comments, and we will get to them in the last part of our event. Now I would like to introduce our moderator, Cassie Conklin. As Greg mentioned in his address, Cassie is a student journalist at Frostburg State University, and we recently worked with her because she was facing some censorship issues by her administration. She's a geographer turned freelance journalist, and she writes for the Bottom Line, which is the student newspaper at Frostburg State, as well as regional outlets like the Cumberland Times News and Allegany magazine. I would also like to introduce our panelists, who are all staff members of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, who used to be student journalists while they were in college. First, Robert Shibley, who is now FIRE's executive director, but for 3 years, Robert wrote and ultimately served as editor for the Duke Review, which is Duke's conservative student publication. And he adds the only publication that Duke's student government refused to fund. He faced challenges such as vigilante censorship, with stacks of this newspaper being stolen and dumped into recycling bins, as well as other issues that he faced throughout his time at the Duke Review. Alex Morey is a journalist and attorney on Fire staff, and she's also the editor-in-chief of our Newsdesk. She was an undergraduate at the University of Arizona when she was a student journalist with the Arizona Daily Wildcat. She is a great example of what student journalism should look like, and she didn't face any censorship during her time at the University of Arizona, which is absolutely fantastic. And not super surprising, because in 2019, the University of Arizona did earn Fire's highest green light rating for its speech protective policies. Go Wildcats. Nico Perino is our vice president for communication, and he worked as a reporter and a columnist at the Indiana Daily Student during his 4 years at Indiana University. He also received the Certificate of Merit in 2012 and 2013 from the Columbia Scholastic Press Association for his published commentary on campus issues. So he's an award-winning student journalist, which is even cooler than maybe the rest of us.
An honorable mention, whatever that means.
Adam Goldstein, he is an attorney with our organization, and he also worked at the Fordham Observer for 3 years during his time at Fordham University. He served as news editor and editor-in-chief during that time, and he'll probably share with you a couple instances of censorship that he recalls, so I won't get into those details. And now I'd like to turn it over to Cassie. Again, remember to take that survey and drop any questions you have in the comments. Thanks, Cassie.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, and thanks so much, Greg, for having me. This year's Student Press Freedom Day theme is Journalism Against All Odds. And between the coronavirus and nearly every campus shuttering last March, to a contentious election cycle, to growing threats of censorship and intimidation, student journalists have faced numerous hardships over the last year, and yet we've persevered, and many have been lauded for their COVID-19 coverage in particular. Robert, as executive director of FIRE, what does Student Press Freedom Day mean to you and the theme Journalism Against All Odds?
Thanks, Cassie. I think it's a great theme, actually, particularly, I want to have a sense of proportion. Obviously, college student journalists, including me, with the newspapers being thrown away. It's not the same thing here in the United States as journalists do often face overseas. The really, the risks of violence and, state censorship, by authorities, national authorities, rather than, maybe the smaller state authorities that run many of our campuses, is obviously a lot more severe. That said, college journalism is not necessarily an easy place to be. There's a lot of scrutiny on college journalists. The administrators are reading your paper, and they will respond if they see things they don't like. They will often authorize sort of increasingly, let's put it this way, I'm amazed at how many inventive ways over the 17 years I've been at FIRE that administrations, and then also the sort of vigilante student censorship has done. One really graphic, and I wish I had a picture of it here to show you. There is one, was another former FIRE staffer worked on The Liberty, which was his newspaper at Oregon State, I believe. And there's actually a really interesting picture. At one point, they de-recognized the newspaper and decided that, if the newspaper's gone, this newspaper actually had distribution bins that looked kind of like the ones that you'd see out on the street, you'd pull them open, or metal ones and everything. And they pulled all of them up one night and dumped them in a dump. And you can see there's this picture of this huge pile of all of these bins just destroyed, pulled up in the dump under cover of night. Eventually, they actually were forced to put the bins back and let the paper operate. But you see all kinds of excuses for defunding, whether it be from the student government itself, because they don't like the coverage. And that is a very common thing that student journalists should look out for. One of the most important things that you can cover is the student government, and they will take steps to do that. Defunding of the ability to publish, that's less sort of existential now than it was at the beginning of FIRE, now that people have websites and things like that to do, but it's still something that's very harmful. And just generally the, the challenges with that, I'm sure we've been facing student journalists over COVID-19. How do you cover a campus that is largely virtual, right? Like, what is how do you cover and know what's going on when you can't actually go there yourself? So I think the journalism all odds theme is a really good one, particularly, and I think it's also a good reminder to student journalists who want to go into journalism that it's a field that right now is going through a lot. It is a very tough field to make a living in. You hear about layoffs and that sort of thing all the time. It doesn't make it any less important, though, is the problem. Even though the revenue streams are going down, the need, like Greg said, for objective and quality news for people to actually pick up the phone and do that, shoe leather reporting hasn't gone away, and but it has gotten harder. And so I think the odds are against you, but that's when you have the chance to shine. And so I think it's a great theme, and it means a lot. I'm glad they picked it.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Robert. You're so right. Journalists aren't just facing obstacles on campus, but off campus, nationally and internationally. Alex, your college journalism experience seems to be a case study in how college journalism should look at the U of A. But nonetheless, as a writer and attorney for FIRE, you've seen how many experiences depart from your own. So what stands out to you this last year in terms of how student journalists have overcome obstacles?
Sure. Well, I think for as long as journalism has existed, Greg alluded to it, journalists of all stripes have had to overcome obstacles in the campus space. This year in particular, in 2020, we definitely saw a censorship spike, not just in student journalism, but in sort of all areas of campus censorship. And, our thought generally is that a lot of it was because of, the controversies going on. When there are controversies, censorship goes hand in hand. So I think one of the best ways to talk about how student journalists have overcome obstacles is just to give a brief rundown of what those obstacles have been. So we've seen that general censorship spike in people wanting, administrators in particular, wanting to quiet down controversies. We've also seen a rash of newspaper thefts. Newspaper thefts were down for 2 decades until very recently when they picked up again. We're seeing it from faculty, from staff, from students taking, hundreds, sometimes thousands of copies of newspapers and dumping them in the trash. We've also seen definitely threats from administrators, as things like prior review, wanting to, intimidate faculty advisors, wanting to, bring students in for interviews for their reporting. We see threats from other students who there was a student at the University of Missouri who was effectively doxxed by another student for covering COVID. Legislators have threatened students and intimidated them, and even donors. We had a case at the University of Chicago that we covered where student journalists found stacks of documents in a garbage can and covered them and revealed this big controversy between a $100 million donor to the University of Chicago and the university. And those donors subpoenaed the student journalists and wanted to know their sources, which apparently in this case was a garbage can. But students are overcoming these. The number one thing that student journalists can do is just do what they do best. Keep reporting. If someone is intimidating you, whether it's another student or an administrator or a legislator or anyone, report about it. Students also should know their rights. FIRE has a ton of student resources, which I believe we have put in the comments of this chat. You can also visit thefire.org. And journalists, my other advice would be know your role and keep perspective historically. The whole point of journalism is to do this stuff and uncover hard stuff and talk about things that the people in power don't want you to talk about. So know when you go into it, it's not just going to be covering campus sports or some of the other stuff that's just fun. Sometimes there's stuff there that really impacts people's lives, and it's your job to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That idea of fighting that chill, fight through that intimidation and just keep writing, don't get off the horse. That's really great. Thank you. Adam, your time with the Fordham Observer, the student newspaper at Fordham University, which makes a nearly annual return to FIRE's top 10 worst colleges for free speech list, was sometimes a little complicated. But as a person who's fought against all odds for more than 2 decades now, what advice do you have for students who are feeling targeted by their university, who might be nursing that first censorship wound, and they're wondering if journalism is right for them, given these obstacles?
That's a fair question. I think the best summary of journalism is still what George Seldes used as the title of one of his books, Tell the Truth and Run. If people aren't gunning for you, you probably aren't maybe cut out for this work, I guess, in that sense. Like I would be concerned 2 things. One is if I was doing the work and I didn't like that people were constantly angry with me, then this might not be a great thing to do lifetime. And if I'm doing the work and nobody's angry with me, I might not be very good at this, and I probably shouldn't do it lifetime. So I think there's a sweet spot in there. And one of the stories we'll talk about, in fact, there was when I was the news editor, and there was one kerfluffle we'll talk about. There was I had a reporter named Ron Zapata and a editor-in-chief named Carolyn Schultz, and they reacted in opposite ways to being censored. Ron doubled down on being a journalist and worked for the AP for a bunch of years, then Law 360. And I just checked, he's a public defender now. He decided to go back to law school, and get his law degree. Kara decided she didn't want to work in news, so she worked in magazines for a bunch of years and wrote young adult novels. And those are 2 rational choices, because when faced with the idea that this job, if done correctly, means I'm going to get calls at 3 a.m. asking to set up meetings with people the next day at 7. If that appeals to you, then this is good. You should like this job and you're good at it. And if that doesn't appeal to you, or you never get that call, there's lots of other jobs in the world. And for what it's worth, I wasn't the world's greatest student journalist myself. I was fine, but I'd like to think I'm probably a better lawyer than I was a journalist. So it's okay to decide you don't want to dedicate your life to it. If you do, that's even better, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you. Yeah. Nico, your time with the Indiana Daily Student was a successful one, an award-winning one. And I read through your columns, including the final one for that paper, entitled "In College Life, Go on the Offensive." One line you wrote, quote, "If you can't stand the occupiers, start your own group and fight for your own causes." And it stood out to me because journalists are often people who have to fight their own battles, on their own 2 feet. And so in what ways has the last year of college journalism really exemplified this idea?
Yeah, it's always dangerous when someone goes and digs through your writings from over a decade ago. Every columnist at the Indiana Daily Student would write kind of a sappy, cliche end of your 10-year column before graduation. And I don't remember everything I said, but it's funny that you bring up the occupiers, because 2010, 2011, during my junior and senior years, the Occupy Wall Street movement was huge on campus. I mean, and especially in Bloomington, Indiana, where I was a college student, they occupied the main square in downtown Bloomington, and they had a very big presence on campus as well. And I remember there was an editorial board meeting, and those of you who are listening who work on the news side, not the editorial side, and your student newspaper might not have an editorial board, we would get together essentially once a week, usually on a weekend, and debate the issues of the day, and then try to come to some sort of consensus, and then assign someone the duty to write the unside editorial, which is supposed to speak for the editorial board or the paper. And at one point, we were critical of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it's been over a decade now, so I don't remember exactly what we said. And so some of the leaders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and it's probably at least a dozen people, came to the offices and demanded a retraction from our editorial board. And we didn't give it to them. But when we think about standing on your own 2 feet, people will try and bully you to take your stories down. You hear about this often with sororities and fraternities. They'll steal your stacks of newspaper if you do some big expose on the Greek system. And so when I think of journalism against all odds and standing on your own 2 feet, and as I said in that column, fighting for your own causes, it means not backing down. It means having agency. It means believing in your cause. It doesn't mean don't listen, but it also means don't let people bully you into changing your mind. So that's what it means to me. And when I think about this last year, I don't know that I need to restate what everyone else has said, but I mean, we're talking about budget declines, across the board, not just for student newspapers, but for colleges and universities writ large, or any institution, it seems like, unless you're Zoom, which has been doing pretty well. We're talking about COVID-19 and the effects that has, aside from the financial ones. We're talking about, the vilification of press writ large and the student press specifically. So yeah, I mean, hopefully this too shall pass and things will be on the upward trend again. But in the meantime, yes, stand on your own 2 feet, defend what you believe, and don't let yourself or your colleagues be bullied into taking a position that you otherwise wouldn't take.
Yeah, I'm really grateful actually, though, that your columns are still up. I know it might be a little creepy that someone went 10 years later.
No, it's there. If you Google my name, they're there.
It was a fabulous rabbit hole, actually, a little bit of a time capsule, I want to shift gears a little bit. Politics in the media is on everyone's mind. And FIRE is well known as a defender of free speech, no matter where that speech falls on the political spectrum. And as such, FIRE has a really strong contingency of conservative supporters. And often I see folks responding to your social media posts, talking about the suppression of conservative thought on college campuses, cancel culture, and this nature of wokeness. Alex, I just followed you on Twitter the other day, and your handle 1A Morey is, clever, but it's also a statement about what you value. And so I wondered if you thought there is an infringement of the First Amendment protected speech and expression happening on college campuses, if that is specifically targeting conservative dissenters. And is this new or a pattern that you've seen for a while?
That's a good question. So first, I just want to go on the record and say somebody took at Alex Morey without asking me. And so I had no choice, but to switch it up a little bit. So the answer to your question, is there a pattern, targeting conservative speakers? I would say yes, absolutely. But so the but is that, censorship on college campuses, even during the spike in censorship that we've seen in the last year, is definitely a nonpartisan issue. It affects people from all ideologies, all backgrounds. Basically, if you want to say something on a college campus, you're at risk no matter what it is you're saying, if it's, mildly controversial. We see public and private institutions that aren't bound by the First Amendment, but have their own institutional promises of free expression, break those promises all the time for many reasons. So it's kind of a tapestry. And of course, if some of my colleagues, hear something that, and want to jump in, go for it. But there are many colleges and universities where, for example, the faculty, it's just a fact, for example, lean left. So, and the students maybe lean left. And so then conservative speakers, yes, are a target, and they say things that are unpopular with the majority of people on campus or majority of people on Twitter that are paying attention. But it's not the full picture. So at FIRE, we are consistently fighting for, the rights of people to talk about pro-life issues and pro-choice issues, students for Bernie and students for Trump, socialism, veganism, we've seen it all. And, again, the reasons behind why students are censored and how students are censored are multifarious. It's not just things like, violations of the First Amendment, but smaller, more obscure policies at these schools that, for example, contradict the First Amendment that students don't notice. We notice. You can check out our Spotlight database where we have all those policies. But some of those policies do or can be abused to impact students' either First Amendment rights, or at private colleges, their free expression rights that those schools have committed to. So yes, conservatives, some conservative speech, a lot of conservative speech is a target these days, but it's important for people to understand that anyone who wants to speak on a college campus, if it's remotely controversial, you're at risk at basically all except the colleges that do it really well. We've got a handful of those, but generally there's a risk to pretty much everyone.
Yeah, and for me, I see an opportunity there for student media outlets to enfranchise students of dissenting political opinions. That is an opportunity to sort of reverse that narrative and reverse that censorship. Adam, one of the controversies from your time, which we mentioned earlier at Fordham, was an article written about an administrator's personal life and how his sexual identity contradicted the policies he advocated for and the public persona he had crafted for himself. In the last year, terms like cancel culture have been coined to describe how public officials and those with platforms have been treated after details of their personal lives come to light. So where do you see the line between what is private information versus what should be made public? And sort of thinking about it in the student press realm, what advice would you have for student editors who are weighing what to publish, when to publish, knowing that in 2021, those consequences could be really severe?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll tell what the story was in short. And it was the early 90s, which was a very different time. The middle of John Paul II's time as Pope, well, not the later 2/3 of John Paul II's time as Pope, but it comes up because Fordham for about 5 years prior had denied approving a student gay rights group. And every year the students performatively went through the process of applying, and every year got back a one-page form signed by a vice president saying your group conflicts with Catholic doctrine, it won't be approved. Ron Zapata, that reporter who I mentioned earlier, who was a very good reporter, unlike me, he was very, very good at being a student journalist. He had discovered that a male maintenance worker had sued this male vice president for sexual harassment. And the vice president's answer filing was that it was a consensual relationship. So it became sort of an interesting quirk that the actual guy denying the gay rights group, whose signature was on that, was himself gay, which nobody knew. When we started to look into that, we got a lot of pushback from the administration. It was never anything quite like, we're going to pull your funding or we're going to shut you down or we demand prior review. But this is where we would get the 3 a.m. phone call from a different vice president saying, show up at my office at 7 a.m. And you can't really say no. And we would show up at the office and his argument would boil down to like, come on. You know, it was like, what he would say, like, hasn't he suffered enough? And it's like, do I seem like I'm here to, like, it's a newspaper. We're not here to torture him. Like, the metric of how much he suffered was not how we were making our editorial judgments. So that was the framework then. Ultimately, we did publish something. We did seriously consider, you know, has he suffered enough? What is the purpose of this? What is the purpose to our readers? How does this affect his life? In the 90s, that was a much easier conversation to have, because in the 90s, we did things like publish everyone's address and call it a phone book. And the only times you got people who got creeped out by personal information in the early 90s was when you had caller ID and they didn't have it yet, and you would know their phone number, and that creeped people out. So then they had caller ID block, and then they had a thing where you could block people who used caller ID block from calling you, and the arms race was won. And eventually now everyone's like, of course you have my phone number, I called you, why would that be surprising? But now they're like, oh, how did you get my address? It's not like we publish books of that. So I would say, would we make the same decision today? I don't know. I will say, number one, if we had thought that him being fired was on the table, we probably wouldn't have run with it. I can't speak for everybody who was on the editorial board at that time, but the consequences for him really boiled down to embarrassment and uncomfortable conversations with the priests on campus. And we felt that was outweighed by the value to the community, especially the LGBT community on campus, to know that this institution that has been denying their ability to express themselves actually has people inside it who suffer in the way that they're suffering, and who are suffering the consequences of what they're trying to fight against, because they wanted to have this rights group to stop that kind of enforced silence that this guy was living under. And we thought the value of that, the probative value, was outweighed by the embarrassment it caused that individual. I say, personally speaking, I never think it's bad to view journalism as a service, and to ask, how do we serve our readers? What is the impact on our sources? What is the impact on our readers? And I don't think it's unjournalistic to say there are some stories that do more harm than good, because we've done that for years, and we've rationalized it in other ways. Whether it's publishing the names of sexual assault victims, publishing the names of children accused of crimes, we have lots of things where we rationalize we're not going to publish it. And what it really boils down to is, at the end of the day, or publishing pictures of vandalism, sometimes we choose not to do that because we don't want to encourage it. We've decided all of these things are places where the harm we're going to cause either the community or some people in it are greater than whatever we're going to deliver to our readers. So I would always have that analysis under the, take those same facts, put them in today. Would I make the same choice? I don't know. Because now cancel culture, there was no cancel culture on the table in the 90s. If I thought there was a realistic probability that by writing a story, I was going to get someone like ostracized from polite society, it would have to be really important for the public to know what happened. And in that particular case, I don't think that would have been important enough.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sort of reflecting on that. I know, it's been 25, 30 years later, but
well, I've had to think about it recently because now Fordham is demanding for justice in Palestine. So I get to think about that constituency and what they go through, and the same analysis of is whatever this group going through, if I had the opportunity to cancel some of those administrators involved in it, I'd have to make that same calculus now and with different information. But the fact that they're still trying to stop groups from happening, I thought was depressing.
Yeah, they haven't quite learned their lesson,
no.
Unfortunately, at Fordham.
Cassie, I'd love to ask maybe a question or two of our panel, but I just wanted to remind our audience that they can, if you're watching on Zoom, you can put questions in the Q&A. If you're watching on YouTube, you can put questions in the comments, and in a couple minutes, we'll probably turn to taking those audience questions.
Great. Yeah. So our final topic before kind of moving to those questions, this panel discussion is entitled Fighting Student Press Censorship, In the 1990s and 2000s, just as FIRE was getting its start, censorship was overt, leading to numerous legal cases, which cost universities and campuses money that they don't really want to spend. And so now, especially over the last decade, censorship seems to have taken a new form. So I'm going to go to Adam just very quickly. I wondered if you had seen any emerging trends over the last 10 years or so. I know you worked with the Student Press Law Center as well, that you'd like to share with us.
Really emerging trends, I guess, would be the medicalization of harm is how we described it in coddling, but it's this idea that I have to silence the paper, not because it offends me, but I have to silence the paper because what you're saying is going to cause some physical harm. It's dangerous. What you're saying is going to cause medical consequences for someone, which it was never an idea before. And it's also, it's strange because it's an attempt to achieve the same ends by using something that's harder to argue with. Like, I can demonstrate that I should be allowed to say offensive things, but how do I prove someone's not going to have a heart attack and die? I don't know. What science would I rely on to demonstrate that? So that excuse has been coming up more and more.
Yeah, thank you. In my experience, it's been like budgetary harm. I'm being sort of censored in order to preserve the brand of the university. That's its own new trend. Nico, your podcast for FIRE called So to Speak, the Free Speech Podcast, has delved into all the topics we've covered here today and many more. And you're usually engaging in this sort of meta-analysis of concepts like censorship. One episode from 2018 asked, is there a free speech crisis on college campuses? And so 3 years later, I'm asking again, do you feel that there's a campus free speech crisis?
You'll note that in those podcasts, we didn't really give an answer. We hosted a debate and tried to have other people kind of bring their perspective to it. And then we had a internal staff discussion about some of the data, and there was mixed opinion on it. But from the perspective of a civil liberties organization, anytime anyone's rights are violated, that's a crisis. We don't only do this work because it's a crisis. I would hope that we would still have jobs if it was just a handful of students who faced press censorship or any other form of censorship. But I will say, beginning in 2014 and up until the present day, we have seen trends that indicate if there's not a crisis, there's an urgency in new and developing ways in which people are being censored or silenced, or new ways in which the chill is brought to bear on campus. You mentioned cancel culture, but we also had the rise. And when I was in college, these weren't even words that were in the popular lexicon, such as microaggressions, disinvitations, trigger warnings, these things. The medicalization of censorship was not even a thing. And then, of course, in 2017, February, my birthday of all days, I remember it very vividly, you got the violence that occurred at the University of California, Berkeley, surrounding Milo Yiannopoulos' appearance. That was the first time, really, that we'd seen people literally throwing Molotov cocktails because they disagreed with the ideas of someone. And then you saw similar instances of violence in the years after. It's kind of quieted down a bit. But last year, Fire saw more case submissions and dealt with more cases than we have ever had to deal with in our entire history over the summer during a pandemic. Summer is the time where we expect a downtick. Our website traffic's down, our case intake's down, but last year it was at record heights. So crisis, I don't know what the threshold is for crisis, but we're busy. So there's no shortage of it.
Yeah, I felt kind of bad thinking about your 2020 summer interns in Philadelphia and how busy they must have been.
Well, they were remote too. It was our first ever intern. I was a fire intern too. And one of the best parts about the internship is the ability it's a learning and professional internship. So you have seminars and you read books, but you also do work. And one of the best things is to come together in the heart of Philadelphia. Our offices overlook Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And anyway, last year's class was the first one not to get to experience that, but we're hopeful perhaps this summer that they will. And is there anyone out there who's interested in an internship? I believe applications are still open. Should definitely apply. It was a life-changing experience for me. I'm still here at Fire over a decade later.
Nice plug there, Nico.
I do what I can.
That. Yeah. I'm going to go to our last question before we move on to viewer questions. And it's for you, Robert. The free press is always facing new threats. And so what advice do you have for student journalists, especially editors, in building resilience against censorship in their organizations? And when faced with censorship, what are those first steps that you suggest they do in addressing it?
Right. I think, just briefly, the best thing you can do is do some training inside your news organization about what rights are, both constitutional rights and on campus. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors that are going on when you get that call from administrators or somebody else telling you or should say something. A lot of times there's a lot of bluster, but behind it, they do not have the legal right to do that. But it can be very frightening, very confusing. You're going to be there sitting, staring at a lot of deans, maybe a lawyer, something like that. That is something that can happen. And unless you know that you've got firm ground to stand on, it's very easy to give in. So I think that's the number one thing that you can do to be resilient. I'd say, just the secondary thing is, make sure that, you have a plan to get the news out if you get derecognized. Make sure your website isn't totally dependent on the university or something. Maybe, I understand it's different for different papers, but, back it up, have these things because, even let's say, they shut you down, they might turn off your website. Let's say you fight it and you come back 2 months later, you need to be able to restore everything, put it there, and hopefully be able to conduct journalism maybe on another website in the meantime. So think about that as well. Make sure that you can't just be taken out. Have a plan to we had to do it in a dorm room because we weren't recognized. So we would do our newspaper in dorm rooms and stuff. So, think about ways you would do that
Thank you so much for that answer. I think that's something that sort of premeditating what would you do if you were censored is unfortunately something we should be thinking about in 2021. Thank you so much. I wish we could talk for the rest of the day. I wish we could celebrate together for the rest of this great Friday. I'm going to let Lindsay take over to ask some of the audience questions.
Thanks, Cassie. We really appreciate Cassie. If you're not familiar with her story, I know Greg talked about it a little bit at the beginning of this event, but if you're not familiar with her story, you should go search her name on Fire's website. because we just came out with an article all about Cassie and her resilience in her student journalism just this week. So we really appreciate her coming on and moderating our panel today. We do have a few audience questions. So the first one is from Mark Newton, and he asks, did any of you have student media experience in high school? And if you did have that experience, if it was rooted in schools and states embracing the Tinker Standard, and the Tinker Standard, for those who don't know, is a case that comes from, or a standard that comes from a case from 1969, when the Supreme Court said that students and schools, including K-12 schools even, have their First Amendment rights while they're on campus. And then he asked, did high school provide you with any First Amendment knowledge or skills to fight? So I don't know, panelists, were any of you guys involved in high school journalism?
Yep.
We
never ran into any tinker problems at the Arrowhead in Ottawa Hills High School in Toledo, Ohio. Go Green Bears. And but it was a great experience. I learned a lot about how to lay out a paper and how the editing process and that thing goes. And I did learn about the First Amendment. I had a pretty good working knowledge of what freedom of the press was supposed to mean. And I do think that if I hadn't had that, I would have been less likely to, work at a, not the mainstream newspaper at Duke. I think from talking to folks now in college, as editor, I'm sure many people watching this are editors or have a little more experience. A lot of the people coming in who want to do reporting there has been a drop off in the amount of First Amendment knowledge or even just basic knowledge that people are coming into college with. So if you've got freshman writers and that sort of thing, you're probably going to have to educate them on it. And that is different, I think, from 20 years ago or more when I got out, but it's just a reality and something that you should be aware of, that they may just not realize that, some of the things about it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was on my high school paper. I say Adam's waving too, so it must have been. I was on the York High, and I wouldn't say we dealt with any tinker style issues or we had the most cutting edge or investigative reporting. If anything, that experience allowed me to dip my toes and just start to understand what it meant to be a journalist, what it meant to lay out a paper, what it meant to write a news article in the reverse pyramid style. That's what it taught me. And I might give a plug here for Ken Paulson, who was one of the founding editors of USA Today. I was just searching my school's alumni list, and it turns out Ken, who's now a big First Amendment advocate, went to my same high school. And he also holds the 200-meter record. I was a track runner in high school and college and could fly. But yeah, so, it taught me a lot. And I would urge high schoolers who have an interest in journalism to learn that way. You don't need to be a journalist or really have any knowledge as to what goes into journalism to get on their student newspaper. It's usually fairly easy. In my school, it was a class. You could actually get credit for it too.
Adam, did you have anything you wanted to add on that question?
I was just going to say hi to Mark Newton, and also, my high school had a paper. They got rid of it my freshman year, so I don't know why. I was a good kid back then. I didn't ask questions.
Yeah, right.
My high school, I'll just answer this question because I might be the only one who was censored in high school, even though I'm not on the panel. So I'm an attorney at Fire now, but when I was in high school, I was on the High Student Journal. We tried to change the name of it to the Blue Devils Advocate, because the Blue Devils were our mascot, and we were turned down by the school board. But that wasn't even the worst. The worst was that our high school was the leader in our state for teen pregnancy. And we tried to write an article about teen pregnancy and what these teen moms went through at our high school. And we did end up getting to publish it, but I was the editor at the time, and I spent many hours in our vice principal's office trying to convince him to let us publish the story. And we were under prior review at the time. So he had to not just allow us to print the story in theory, but he had to read, every line of it and approve it, which is actually illegal and is extra illegal in Washington State, where I was in high school at the time. Now it's extra illegal under the New Voices law. And actually, I first learned about the First Amendment and fell in love with it at high school journalism summer camp. So I didn't realize it was a career I could go into at the time, but I thought it was pretty nifty, and I'm glad I did end up making it my career. The next question that we have is from Campus News, and I'm just trying to find it again in my feed here. So they ask, are we looking into the silencing of student presses because of the pandemic via the canceling of print runs and not really accepting online papers into services like Canvas and Blackboard? So I think the question is, print publications aren't coming out so much, but maybe there's not as much access to student newspapers because they're also not on these online forums where classes are taking place.
I don't think that we have seen anything like that, but if that's happening, I'd be interested to know more. So feel free to submit a case or get in touch with FIRE. It may or may not be something we can help with, especially if the problem is with private companies who are doing this stuff. But I would like to know what's there. I think there have been ramifications of COVID that have sort of gone under the surface. I know that reporting on COVID on campus can be very tough. Universities, they're even silencing, faculty about what they can say about it. But also, if you're saying there was an outbreak, we've had universities freak out about that. Whereas that's very clearly protected news report. Like, there is absolutely no reason that they can stop you from doing that, but yet there's the pushback. So please do let us know if you know what's going on. I'm interested to hear more.
And I think that's about time for us. So if anybody has more questions, you're totally feel free to shoot us an email. If you are facing any sort of censorship as a student journalist or just as a student or faculty member, student media advisor, please submit a case. I will drop in the comments here in a second because I'm bad at multitasking, the link to submit a case. Also, again, please take the survey that we have in the description on YouTube, and I will be able to send you free swag in the mail, which I know, especially right now during the pandemic, it is so exciting, for me at least, when I get to open my front door and see a package, because it's the only exciting thing that happens anymore. So let me make your day.
And socks. I mean, we hear a lot of great feedback genuinely about these socks. We have to prevent the FIRE staffers from going into the sock closet. These are ones you want.
I don't even have a pair of socks, so I will be jealous of you.
You gotta sneak in there like I did.
Anyway, happy Student Press Freedom Day, and please let us know if we can ever be of help to any of you. Thank you for joining us today. This was a great discussion, and thank you to all of our panelists, and especially to Cassie. Thank you so much, Cassie. Thank you.